February 19, 1945. Dawn breaks over volcanic rock. 22,000 Japanese soldiers wait underground. They think Americans fight like children. Lieutenant Yamamoto crouched in the volcanic tunnel, his shoulders shaking with laughter as he read the intelligence report aloud to his squad. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, as his voice echoed through the interconnected passages carved deep beneath Iwo Jima's surface. "Listen to this," he said, waving the paper in the sulphurous air. "The Americans have a new weapon. They call it a flamethrower. It shoots fire 20 yards and carries fuel for 7 seconds. The soldiers erupted in fresh peals of laughter, their voices bouncing off the tunnel walls like ricocheting bullets. Sergeant Tanaka wiped tears from his eyes, his scarred face creased with amusement. 7 seconds? My grandmother could hold her breath longer than that. More laughter rippled through the tunnel system as word spread from bunker to bunker through the 11 miles of interconnected passages that honeycombed the island's Dold. Volcanic rock. The tunnels represented months of backbreaking labor, carved by hand through the soft volcanic stone that made excavation surprisingly manageable. Every passage, every chamber, every firing position had been precisely planned by General Kuribayashi himself. Even the old soldier had smiled when the reports about American flamethrowers first arrived. In the main command bunker, 2 levels below the surface, Major Ida spread detailed maps across a wooden table illuminated by oil lamps. The sulphurous smell of the volcanic rock mixed with the acrid smoke from their makeshift lighting, creating an atmosphere that had become home to the 22,000 Japanese defenders. "Look at these American toys," Ida said, pointing to sketched diagrams of the M2 flamethrower system. 70 pounds of equipment for 7 seconds of fire. They must think we built sandcastles instead of concrete and steel. His staff officers nodded in agreement, their confidence bolstered by the massive fortifications surrounding them. The underground complex represented the most sophisticated defensive network ever constructed in the Pacific War. Concrete pillboxes with steel-reinforced firing slits connected to ammunition storage areas through narrow passages. Machine gun positions were pre-sighted to create overlapping fields of fire across every possible approach route. Artillery emplacements had already calculated firing solutions for every square yard of the landing beaches. Private Watanabe, barely 18 but already a veteran of previous island battles, cleaned his Arisaka rifle in the dim light. "Remember Saipan?" he asked his bunkmate. "The Americans came with their big ships and big guns, thinking noise would scare us. Then they learned what real fighting looked like." His companion, Corporal Sato, nodded grimly. "But this time we are ready from the beginning. No more dying on beaches where their ships can see us. Let them come into our tunnels and see how their fire toys work in concrete chambers." The volcanic rock that formed Iwo Jima's foundation had proved ideal for their purposes. Unlike the coral formations of other Pacific islands, this stone could be carved with simple tools, allowing rapid excavation of the extensive tunnel network. Engineers had reinforced key positions with concrete and steel, salvaged from damaged ships. Captain Nishimura emerged from Tunnel Complex C, his uniform grey, with volcanic dust that coated everything in their underground world. He carried reports from the forward observation posts, hidden among the rocks and camouflaged so perfectly that American reconnaissance flights had failed to detect most of them. "The American ships gathered offshore," he reported to Major Ida. "Intelligence estimates 60,000 Marines aboard the transports. They plan to use their usual tactics. Heavy bombardment, then waves of assault troops hitting the beaches." He paused, allowing himself a slight smile. "They have no idea what waits for them down here." The laughter continued to echo through the tunnels as soldiers shared stories about the coming battle. They had studied American tactics from previous invasions. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, always the same pattern. Massive naval bombardment designed to destroy surface defenses, followed by direct assault across open beaches, where American numerical superiority could overwhelm defenders. But General Kuribayashi had learned from those defeats. Surface defenses, no matter how strong, could not survive the awesome firepower of American battleships and aircraft carriers. The solution lay underground, in a network of positions that could survive bombardment and strike back when the Marines thought the fighting was over. Sergeant Major Yoshida, a career soldier with 20 years of service, gathered his squad leaders in the deepest bunker. Maps covered every surface, showing firing lanes, fallback routes, and ammunition caches distributed throughout the tunnel system. Each position had been surveyed and measured, with artillery coordinates calculated to support every conceivable defensive scenario. "Remember," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "we are not trying to stop them at the beaches. We let them land. We let them think they have won. Then we show them what real fighting looks like." His scarred hands traced the tunnel routes on the map, showing how defenders could move unseen beneath Marine positions. The volcanic dust continued to drift through the tunnels, settling on equipment and uniforms like grey snow. In a few hours, American ships would begin their bombardment, pounding the surface with thousands of tons of high explosives. But down here, protected by tons of volcanic rock and concrete, 22,000 Japanese soldiers waited with confidence and contempt for their enemies' fire toys. They had no idea that both armies would soon burn together in these same tunnels. Aboard the USS El Dorado, flagship of the 5th Amphibious Corps, Colonel Harry Liversedge studied aerial photographs spread across the steel table. The black and white images showed Iwo Jima's scarred surface, pockmarked with what intelligence officers believed were defensive positions. Steam rose from his coffee mug as the ship rolled in Pacific swells. "Gentlemen," he said to assembled Marine officers, "we're looking at 8 square miles of volcanic hell. Intelligence estimates 13,000 Japanese defenders, maybe less after our bombardment." He tapped the photographs with his pointer. Standard pillbox construction, reinforced concrete, overlapping fields of fire. Major Robert Dunlap, commanding the 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, leaned forward to examine the images. His weathered face showed strain from previous Pacific campaigns. Saipan had taught him that Japanese defensive positions were never as simple as they appeared from the air. "What about these new flamethrowers?" Dunlap asked. "Division says they're our answer to fortified positions." Captain James Headley, the battalion's weapons officer, opened a manila folder containing technical specifications. "The M2 flamethrower system," he began, reading from documents. 2 tanks containing thickened gasoline, 1 tank of compressed nitrogen for propulsion. Total weight 70 pounds when fully loaded. The officers listened intently as Headley continued. The weapon's effective range stretched only 20 yards, requiring operators to approach within hand grenade distance of enemy positions. Each tank carried enough fuel for approximately 7 seconds of continuous fire, though tactical doctrine called for short, controlled bursts. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson rubbed his stubbled jaw thoughtfully. 7 seconds doesn't sound like much time to clear a concrete bunker. "That's why we're training teams of 3, Headley explained. 1 operator, 2 riflemen for suppressive fire. Get close enough for the flamethrower to do its work, then move to the next position. Through the porthole, Iwo Jima's grey silhouette grew larger as Task Force 58 approached. 16 battleships and cruisers had been pounding the volcanic rock for 3 days, their shells raising massive clouds of black dust that hung over the island like a funeral shroud. Sergeant Frank Caldwell, a veteran flamethrower operator from Saipan, sat in the troop compartment below decks, methodically checking his equipment. The M2 system lay disassembled on the metal deck, its components cleaned and inspected for the 3rd time. Around him, younger Marines watched nervously. "How bad is it really, Sergeant?" asked Private Tommy Morrison, barely 19 and fresh from Camp Pendleton training. Caldwell looked up from the flamethrower's ignition system, his eyes carrying the weight of previous battles. "Bad enough," he said simply, "but it works. These concrete positions can't be taken any other way. Grenades bounce off, rifle fire just chips the paint, but this gets their attention." The briefing continued as intelligence officers presented their analysis. Aerial reconnaissance had identified approximately 200 defensive positions scattered across the island's surface. Most appeared to be standard Japanese construction, PN, concrete and steel pillboxes with narrow firing slits, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. "The key is coordination," Colonel Liversedge emphasized. "Flamethrower teams work with regular infantry and armor support. We suppress the position with rifle and machine gun fire. Then the flamethrower moves in for the kill." Major Dunlap studied tactical diagrams showing planned assault routes across the black sand beaches. "What about casualties? These operators will be prime targets once they start firing." The question hung in the air like smoke from the ship's stacks. Everyone understood the mathematics of amphibious assault. Flamethrower operators would be moving forward under direct fire, carrying 70 pounds of highly flammable equipment, approaching within 20 yards of enemy positions, designed specifically to kill advancing infantry. Captain Headley consulted his casualty estimates, though the numbers seemed inadequate to describe the reality awaiting them. "Acceptable losses," he said finally, using the clinical language that made war planning possible. Outside, the bombardment continued as American shells crashed into the island's surface, raising clouds of volcanic dust that would soon be mixed with something far more terrible. At 9 in the morning, on February 19th, 1945, the first wave of landing craft churned through choppy seas toward Iwo Jima's eastern beaches. The volcanic island loomed ahead like a prehistoric monster emerging from the depths, its black slopes shrouded in smoke from 3 days of continuous bombardment. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez crouched in the bow of his Higgins boat, clutching his M1 Garand rifle while salt spray stung his face. Around him, 30 other Marines sat in grim silence as their landing craft pitched and rolled through the swells. The stench of diesel fuel and vomit filled the cramped compartment. 2 minutes! Shouted the boat's coxswain over the roar of engines and crashing waves. Sergeant Caldwell adjusted the straps of his M2 flamethrower system, feeling the familiar weight of 70 pounds of equipment settle across his shoulders. The thickened gasoline sloshed quietly in the twin tanks on his back as the boat lurched through another wave. The beaches of Iwo Jima stretched ahead like a ribbon of black sand, darker than anything Rodriguez had ever seen. Volcanic ash from centuries of eruptions had created a landscape that looked more like the surface of another planet than a tropical Pacific island. No palm trees, no white coral sand, just black volcanic death. As the first wave of landing craft approached the shore, an eerie silence settled over the battlefield. No machine gun fire crackled from hidden positions. No mortar rounds exploded among the approaching boats. The massive naval bombardment had apparently done its work. "Maybe intelligence was right," Rodriguez muttered. "Maybe there's nothing left alive on that rock." The Higgins boat's ramp dropped with a metallic clang, and Marines poured onto the black sand of Green Beach. Rodriguez's boots immediately sank ankle-deep into the loose volcanic ash that covered the shoreline like charcoal dust. Each step required tremendous effort as the fine particles shifted beneath their weight. Caldwell struggled forward with his flamethrower, the loose sand making every movement exhausting. Around him, other Marines cursed as they fought their way up the beach, their equipment weighing them down. Vehicles that had landed earlier sat motionless, their tracks spinning uselessly in the ash. For nearly an hour, waves of Marines continued landing. Thousands of men struggled inland, forming a dense concentration of troops packed tightly together on the narrow strip of sand between the water's edge and the first volcanic ridge. Still, no enemy fire disrupted their advance. Lieutenant Yamamoto watched through a periscope from his concealed observation post, carved deep into volcanic rock 200 yards inland. His radio operator crouched beside him in the cramped concrete bunker, waiting for the order that would unleash hell on the unsuspecting Americans. "Look at them," Yamamoto whispered, "packed together like fish in a barrel. They think our bombardment destroyed everything." He counted the waves of landing craft still approaching, estimating the number of Marines now concentrated on the black beaches. The American flamethrower teams moved forward with advancing infantry, their distinctive three-tank silhouettes clearly visible against the volcanic landscape. Through field glasses, Yamamoto could see operators struggling with heavy equipment, sinking deep into loose ash with every step. "Fire toys," he said with contempt, remembering the intelligence briefings that had provoked such laughter in the tunnels. 7 seconds of fuel to clear our concrete bunkers. In the main command bunker far below surface, General Kuribayashi studied reports from forward observers. Nearly 10,000 American Marines had landed, with more waves approaching every few minutes. The volcanic ash was doing exactly what he had hoped, slowing their advance and concentrating them in predictable locations. At 10:30 in the morning, Kuribayashi gave the order. All across Iwo Jima's volcanic landscape, carefully concealed positions erupted simultaneously with deadly, accurate fire. Machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery pieces opened up on the packed beaches with devastating effect. The Marines, caught completely by surprise, found themselves trapped in a killing zone. Rodriguez threw himself flat against black sand as bullets whined overhead, but the loose volcanic ash provided no protection. Around him, Marines screamed and died as enemy fire raked the exposed beaches. The carefully planned assault had become a nightmare in seconds. Sergeant Caldwell's flamethrower team pressed forward toward a concrete pillbox that had suddenly materialized from volcanic rock, its machine gun spitting death at trapped Americans. Through the chaos, he could hear Japanese voices shouting commands from hidden positions that aerial reconnaissance had completely missed. As his team approached the first enemy position, Caldwell prepared to prove that American fire toys were more dangerous than the enemy had imagined. But in the tunnels below, Lieutenant Yamamoto was learning the same lesson about underestimating opponents. The real battle for Iwo Jima was just beginning, and both sides would soon discover that their assumptions about each other were terrifyingly wrong. Sergeant Caldwell's boots slipped on the loose volcanic ash as he approached the concrete pillbox, its machine gun barrel protruding through a narrow firing slit like a serpent's tongue tasting the air. Behind him, Privates Morrison and Jenkins provided covering fire, their M1 rifles cracking steadily as bullets chipped concrete around the Japanese position. "Get ready!" Caldwell shouted over the din of battle, his voice barely audible above the chaos engulfing the black beaches. He could feel the weight of the M2 flamethrower pulling at his shoulders, 70 pounds of equipment that would either save his squad or get him killed. The pillbox erupted with muzzle flashes as the Japanese machine gunner swept the area with deadly, accurate fire. Marines dove for cover that didn't exist on the exposed volcanic slopes, their bodies creating dark silhouettes against the black sand as enemy bullets found their marks. Caldwell pressed the ignition switch and squeezed the trigger. A stream of burning gasoline erupted from the nozzle, stretching 20 yards across the volcanic landscape like a dragon's breath. The flames struck the concrete fortification with a roar that drowned out every other sound on the battlefield. Thickened fuel splashed against the firing slit and poured through the opening, carrying temperatures of 2,000 degrees into the cramped interior. The machine gun fell silent. In the concrete chamber below, 3 Japanese soldiers experienced hell in its purest form. The burning gasoline consumed every molecule of oxygen in seconds, creating a vacuum that sucked the breath from their lungs even as the flames seared their flesh. Private Nakamura, the machine gunner, tried to scream but found only superheated air rushing into his throat like molten metal. Lieutenant Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his observation post 200 yards away, watched in shock as American flame struck his carefully constructed defenses. Through his field glasses, he could see the concrete pillbox that had taken his men weeks to build, suddenly transformed into a crematorium. "Impossible," he whispered to his radio operator. "Intelligence said 7 seconds of fuel. How can they maintain such fire?" What Yamamoto didn't understand was that Sergeant Caldwell had used a technique developed through brutal experience on previous Pacific battlefields. Instead of continuous fire, he delivered the flame in controlled bursts, maximizing the weapon's limited fuel supply while ensuring complete saturation of the target. The smell hit the American lines first, a nauseating mixture of burning flesh, melting metal, and chemical smoke that made even hardened Marines retch into the volcanic ash. Morrison, barely 19 years old, doubled over and vomited as the reality of what their weapon had done became clear. "Jesus Christ," Jenkins muttered, staring at the smoking pillbox where human screams had been replaced by an ominous crackling sound. "What have we done?" Caldwell felt the familiar weight of horror settling on his shoulders, heavier than any equipment he carried. At Saipan, he had learned that flamethrowers didn't just kill, they obliterated. But seeing the weapon's effects never became easier, no matter how many times he witnessed the complete destruction of human beings. In the tunnels below, the psychological impact rippled through Japanese positions like seismic waves. Soldiers who had dismissed American flamethrowers as toys now understood they faced a weapon that could turn their concrete shelters into ovens. The protective tunnels that had seemed so secure suddenly felt like potential death traps. Corporal Sato, crouched in Bunker Complex 7, heard the reports crackling over field telephones. "Pillbox 12, destroyed by flame attack. No survivors. Pillbox 15, under flame attack." No response. His hands shook as he gripped his Arisaka rifle, knowing that concrete walls offered no protection. But the horror wasn't limited to one side. As Caldwell's team advanced toward their next target, Private Morrison made a discovery that would haunt him forever. Through a crack in the destroyed pillbox's wall, he glimpsed the interior where 3 human figures sat in positions that suggested they had died trying to escape through a rear entrance that didn't exist. "Sarge," Morrison called out, his voice cracking. "There's something you need to see." Caldwell looked through the gap and immediately understood why flamethrower operators suffered casualty rates that defied military statistics. It wasn't just the enemy fire they faced or the technical dangers of carrying volatile equipment. It was the psychological toll of witnessing what their weapon did to other human beings at close range. The burned remains in the pillbox had been sons, brothers, fathers, men who had laughed at intelligence reports just that morning. Now they were charred shadows of their former selves, victims of a weapon that killed in the most horrific way imaginable. Back in the tunnel complex, Lieutenant Yamamoto gathered his surviving squad leaders for an emergency conference. The concrete walls that had seemed so solid now felt thin and inadequate against the American flame weapons. Maps showing overlapping fields of fire suddenly looked meaningless. "New orders," he announced, his voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at his stomach. Any Marine carrying the 3-tank flame system becomes priority target for all positions. Concentrate all fire on the flame operators first, then engage other targets. What neither side fully grasped yet was that the flamethrower had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare on Iwo Jima. It wasn't just another weapon, it was psychological terror that would drive both armies deeper into the volcanic tunnels, where the real nightmare was about to begin. As Sergeant Caldwell prepared his team for the next assault, he had no way of knowing that his 4-minute life expectancy had just started counting down. In the tunnels below, Japanese soldiers were preparing countermeasures that would turn the hunters into the hunted. The volcanic island was about to become a crematorium for both sides. By noon on February 19th, the laughter in the Japanese tunnels had been replaced by whispered prayers and desperate tactical conferences. Lieutenant Yamamoto crouched in the main communication bunker, studying field reports that painted a horrifying picture of American flame weapons systematically destroying positions that had taken months to construct. "Pillbox 18 reports flame attack imminent," came the crackling voice over the field telephone. "Marines approaching with 3-tank system." A pause, filled with static and distant rifle fire. Then silence. Yamamoto slammed his fist against the concrete wall, volcanic dust cascading from the ceiling like grey snow. The defensive network that General Kuribayashi had carefully designed was being burned away position by position, and the American flamethrower operators were learning to hunt Japanese defenders with terrifying efficiency. Above ground, Sergeant Caldwell's replacement team advanced through the volcanic landscape toward their next target. Private Rodriguez, carrying his first flamethrower into combat, struggled with the unfamiliar weight as his boots sank deep into the black ash. The original Caldwell had been evacuated with severe burns after his fuel tank developed a leak. "Keep low and keep moving," whispered Corporal Hayes, the team leader who had survived 3 previous Pacific campaigns. "Once you light that thing up, every Jap on the island is going to be shooting at you." Rodriguez nodded nervously, checking his ignition system for the 10th time. The M2 flamethrower felt like carrying death itself. DP pose 70 pounds of volatile equipment that could save his squad or turn him into a human torch if enemy fire punctured the fuel tanks. The Japanese had adapted their tactics with deadly efficiency. In concealed positions throughout the tunnel network, soldiers now carried specific orders. Identify the distinctive silhouette of the 3-tank backpack system. Concentrate all available firepower on the operator. Ignore other targets until the flame threat was eliminated. Private Watanabe, positioned in a camouflaged spider hole 50 yards from the advancing Americans, sighted his Arisaka rifle on the Marine carrying the flamethrower. His hands trembled as he remembered the screams from Pillbox 12 earlier that morning. 3 of his closest friends burned alive. "For Nakamura," he whispered, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Rodriguez in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the volcanic ash. The flamethrower's fuel line ruptured, spraying thickened gasoline across the black sand like blood from an arterial wound. "Flame down! Flame down!" Hayes screamed into his radio as enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. The Japanese had been waiting, using the tunnels to position themselves in overlapping fields of fire that turned the volcanic slope into a killing zone. But the Americans had learned brutal lessons too. Even as Rodriguez writhed in agony, Hayes was implementing new tactical doctrine developed through bitter experience. Instead of retreating, he called for the wet burst technique that had become standard operating procedure. Private Morrison, advancing with a second flamethrower team, approached the target pillbox from a different angle. He fired several bursts without ignition, soaking the concrete structure with unlit fuel. The pungent smell of gasoline filled the air as volatile liquid pooled around firing slits and seeped through gaps in the concrete. In the pillbox, Sergeant Tanaka and his machine gun crew found themselves sitting in a pool of American gasoline, the fumes burning their eyes and throats. They understood exactly what was about to happen, but had no way to escape from their concrete tomb. Morrison ignited his flamethrower. The explosion shook the entire volcanic slope as accumulated fuel vapors detonated in a fireball visible from the beaches. The concrete structure, designed to withstand direct hits from naval artillery, cracked and crumbled under intense heat. Inside, 4 Japanese soldiers died instantly as temperatures exceeded 3,000 degrees. The psychological warfare was working both ways. Japanese soldiers, witnessing the complete destruction of positions they had considered impregnable, began to understand that their tunnel network might become their grave. But American flamethrower operators faced an even more terrifying realization. The enemy was learning to hunt them specifically. In the communication bunker, Lieutenant Yamamoto received reports that made his blood run cold. American flame teams were using coordinated attacks, multiple operators approaching from different angles, wet burst techniques that turned Japanese positions into bombs. "Sir," reported Corporal Sato, his voice shaking, "we've lost 16 positions to flame attacks in 4 hours. The Americans are learning our defensive layouts." What neither side fully understood was that they were trapped in an escalating cycle of tactical innovation driven by mutual terror. Japanese defenders developed new methods to kill flamethrower operators, while Americans created more devastating techniques to clear underground positions. Private Morrison, his face blackened with soot and hands trembling from the morning's carnage, stared at the smoking ruins of the pillbox his weapon had destroyed. The smell of burning flesh mixed with volcanic sulfur created an atmosphere that seemed to come from hell itself. The tunnels that had once echoed with confident laughter now carried only the sounds of dying men and mechanical clicking of rifles being loaded for the next inevitable encounter between flame and concrete. Both sides were learning that on Iwo Jima there would be no winners, only survivors. The scream began at 4:30 in the afternoon on February 20th, echoing through the volcanic tunnels like the voice of hell itself. Private First Class Danny Morrison pressed his face against the black sand, his hands shaking as he tried to block out the sound that had been tearing through the air for nearly 6 hours. 50 yards ahead, somewhere in the Japanese caves, Marine Private Tommy Rodriguez was dying in the most horrific way imaginable. His flamethrower had misfired during the morning assault, the ignition system sparking but failing to light. In that moment of mechanical failure, 2 Japanese soldiers had rushed out, grabbed him, and dragged him into the darkness. "We have to do something," Morrison whispered to Corporal Hayes, who crouched beside him in a shell crater. "We can't just leave him there." Hayes stared at the cave entrance where Rodriguez had disappeared, his weathered face etched with exhaustion and horror. He had seen flamethrower operators captured before, and he knew exactly what was happening in those tunnels. The Japanese didn't consider flame weapon users to be regular soldiers, they were executioners, and they were treated accordingly. The screaming continued, sometimes rising to an inhuman pitch that made even hardened Marines weep, sometimes dropping to a hoarse whisper that was somehow worse than the loudest shrieks. Rodriguez was being kept alive deliberately, his agony prolonged as both punishment and psychological warfare against his comrades who could hear every moment. "Listen to me," Hayes said quietly to his squad. "There's nothing we can do for Rodriguez now. Nothing. Our job is to stay alive and complete the mission." But the mission had become a nightmare that defied every tactical manual. American intelligence had estimated heavy casualties for flamethrower operators, but the reality exceeded their worst projections. Of the 380 flame weapon specialists who had landed just 2 days earlier, fewer than 200 remained combat effective. In the Japanese tunnel complex below, Lieutenant Yamamoto supervised the interrogation with professional duty and personal revulsion. He understood the psychological value of keeping the Marine alive and screaming. Every American within half a mile could hear Rodriguez's agony, and the sound was more effective than any artillery barrage. "He keeps asking for water," reported Sergeant Ishida, emerging from the deeper tunnels. "Should we give him some?" Yamamoto considered carefully. Keeping the American alive served their tactical purposes, but prolonging his suffering also served their desire for revenge against the flame weapons that had incinerated so many comrades. The burned remains of Japanese soldiers killed by flamethrowers had been beyond recognition, showed skeletons that had once been brothers, sons, friends. "Give him just enough to keep him conscious," Yamamoto decided. "Make sure the Americans can still hear him." Above ground, the psychological impact was devastating. Marines who had shown remarkable courage under conventional fire found themselves paralyzed by the sounds emerging from the cave system. The screaming represented every flamethrower operator's worst nightmare, capture alive, followed by prolonged torture. Private Morrison clutched his M1 rifle so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had volunteered for flamethrower training after watching Japanese pillboxes tear apart his squad, but now he understood why the casualty rates were catastrophic. It wasn't just the technical dangers of carrying volatile fuel or the concentrated enemy fire. It was the knowledge that capture meant something far worse than death. The screaming suddenly stopped. In the terrible silence, Morrison and his squad mates stared at the cave entrance, hoping that Rodriguez's ordeal had finally ended. But then the sound began again, weaker now but somehow more heartbreaking. The broken whimpering of a human being pushed beyond endurance, but still clinging to life. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private Jenkins, tears streaming down his face. "How long are they going to keep this up?" The answer came from Hayes, who had seen this psychological warfare before. "Until he dies naturally, or until we silence that cave permanently." But silencing the cave meant advancing across 50 yards of open ground under direct observation from multiple Japanese positions. It meant exposing themselves to the same fate that had befallen Rodriguez. In the tunnel below, Rodriguez hung suspended between consciousness and merciful oblivion. His body had been burned with heated metal rods, his fingers broken one by one, his flesh carved with bayonets in patterns designed to maximize pain without causing fatal blood loss. The Japanese soldiers took turns inflicting new torments, their anger at the flame weapons driving them to cruelty that shocked their own officers. Perhaps the worst part was that Rodriguez remained aware enough to understand what was happening. He could hear the voices of his squad mates calling his name from far above. He knew they were listening to his screams, knew that his agony was being used as a weapon against them. The psychological damage spread through the American lines like a contagion. Marines who had never shown fear under artillery bombardment found themselves unable to function while Rodriguez's torture continued. The sound of human suffering had become more effective than any conventional weapon at breaking fighting spirit. As darkness fell over Iwo Jima's volcanic landscape, the screaming finally stopped permanently. Rodriguez had died sometime during the night, his voice giving out before his tormentors finished their work. But the silence that followed was almost worse, because now every American flamethrower operator knew exactly what awaited them if they were captured alive. The tunnels of Iwo Jima had become a place where humanity itself went to die. By February 23rd, the distinction between hunter and hunted had completely dissolved in the volcanic tunnels of Iwo Jima. What had begun as a tactical battle between American flamethrowers and Japanese concrete fortifications had devolved into mutual slaughter that trapped both armies in an underground nightmare. Corporal Hayes crouched in the entrance to Tunnel Complex 7, his flamethrower's fuel gauge showing less than half capacity. Behind him, the charred remains of 3 Japanese soldiers lay twisted in positions that suggested they had died trying to claw through solid rock to escape the flames. The smell of burned flesh mixed with sulphurous volcanic gases created an atmosphere that seemed to come from hell itself. "Jesus, Sarge," whispered Private Morrison, staring at the bodies. "Look at their hands." Hayes looked. The dead Japanese soldiers' fingernails were torn away, their fingertips bloody from scratching desperately at tunnel walls as 2,000-degree flames consumed the oxygen around them. Even in death, their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror. But 30 yards deeper in the same tunnel system, the tables had turned with horrifying completeness. Japanese Private Watanabe pressed his back against the volcanic rock, listening to the screams of American Marines who had become trapped in a section that his squad had sealed with explosives. "Please," came a voice in broken English from the sealed passage. "Please, we surrender. Let us out." Watanabe closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound. He had watched his 3 closest friends burn alive in a pillbox 2 days earlier, their screams echoing in his memory. Now, it was the Americans' turn to experience the terror of being buried alive in the volcanic tunnels, slowly suffocating as their air supply dwindled. The irony was not lost on either side. Japanese soldiers, who had once mocked American flamethrowers as ineffective toys, now lived in constant fear of the weapon that could turn their protective tunnels into crematoriums. American Marines, who had initially seen the flame weapons as the perfect solution, now understood that every tunnel they entered might become their grave. In the deeper levels of the tunnel complex, Lieutenant Yamamoto studied casualty reports that painted a picture of mutual annihilation. His defensive force of 22,000 men had been reduced to fewer than 8,000 combat-effective soldiers. But American losses were equally catastrophic. Entire companies had simply vanished into the tunnel system. "Sir," reported Sergeant Ishida, his voice hoarse from breathing volcanic dust and chemical smoke. "The Americans have sealed tunnel entrance 12 with explosives. We have 40 men trapped inside." Yamamoto nodded grimly. The Americans had learned Japanese tactics and were using them with devastating effectiveness. Seal the tunnels, trap the defenders inside, then use flamethrowers to clear the passages. It was efficient, brutal, and completely without mercy. Above ground, the February wind carried the sounds of dying men from dozens of sealed tunnel entrances. Marines and Japanese soldiers alike found themselves trapped in underground chambers, some burning alive as flamethrowers pumped superheated gases through ventilation shafts, others slowly suffocating. Private Morrison emerged from Tunnel Complex 9, his face blackened with soot and hands trembling uncontrollably. Behind him, the tunnel entrance glowed with residual heat from the flame attack that had just cleared 17 Japanese positions. The volcanic rock itself had begun to crack from the intense temperatures. "How many?" asked Corporal Hayes, though he dreaded the answer. 37 confirmed kills," Morrison replied, his voice barely audible. "All burned. Some were still alive when I went in to check." The psychological toll was becoming unbearable for both sides. American flamethrower operators, originally trained to clear fortified positions quickly, now found themselves conducting systematic extermination campaigns. Japanese defenders, who had entered the battle with confidence in their underground fortress, now faced the daily reality of being roasted alive in chambers they had built themselves. The volcanic island had become a laboratory for testing the limits of human cruelty. Every tactical innovation by one side prompted an even more brutal response from the other. Americans developed new techniques for forcing flaming gasoline into ventilation systems. Japanese soldiers perfected methods for collapsing tunnels on advancing Marines. By sunset on February 23rd, casualty statistics had become meaningless. Of the original 380 American flamethrower operators who had landed on Iwo Jima, only 62 remained alive and combat effective. Japanese losses were proportionally similar, entire battalions reduced to squad-sized units hiding in the deepest tunnels. Neither side was winning. Both armies were simply burning together in the volcanic hell they had created, trapped in a cycle of mutual destruction that would continue until one side was completely annihilated. The tunnels that had once echoed with confident laughter now carried only the sounds of men dying in horrific ways, Americans and Japanese alike, united in their final moments by being burned alive in the darkness beneath Iwo Jima. On February 25th, the sound that had haunted American nightmares for a week finally arrived on Iwo Jima's black beaches, the deep rumble of tank engines. But these were not ordinary Sherman tanks. The M4A3R, 3 flame tanks that rolled off the landing craft, looked identical to regular Shermans, but their main guns had been replaced with something far more terrifying. Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski sat in the commander's cupola of Hell's Kitchen, watching the volcanic landscape through his periscope as his tank churned through the loose black sand. Instead of the usual 75mm cannon, his Sherman carried 300 gallons of thickened gasoline and a flame projector capable of shooting fire 100 yards, 5 times farther than handheld M2 systems. "Driver, halt," Kowalski ordered through the intercom as they approached Tunnel Complex 15. "Gunner, traverse left. Target that cave entrance at 2 o'clock. Private Bobby Chen, the tank's flame operator, adjusted his controls and sighted at the dark opening carved into volcanic rock. Somewhere in those tunnels, Japanese soldiers were waiting with the same terror that American Marines had felt, carrying portable flamethrowers. "Range 100 yards, Chen reported, ready to fire." The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese observers, watching from concealed positions, saw the Sherman's turret traverse toward their positions and understood exactly what was about to happen. These weren't Marines struggling across open ground with 70-pound backpacks. These were armored vehicles carrying enough fuel to burn out entire tunnel complexes. In the depths of Tunnel Complex 15, Lieutenant Yamamoto received frantic reports. Flame tank approaching main entrance. American tank with flame weapon system. Estimated fuel capacity 300 gallons. Yamamoto closed his eyes, calculating the mathematics of destruction. A single flame tank carried enough fuel to equal 43 portable flamethrowers. The tunnels that had provided protection against infantry-carried flame weapons would become death traps when faced with armored flame projectors. "All positions, concentrate fire on the tank," he ordered. "Anti-tank weapons, prepare for immediate engagement." Above ground, Hell's Kitchen erupted with the distinctive roar of a tank-mounted flamethrower system. A massive stream of burning gasoline shot across the volcanic landscape, striking the tunnel entrance with liquid fire. The flame penetrated deep into the complex, following every passage and air shaft, carrying temperatures that made handheld weapons seem gentle. The screaming began immediately. Japanese soldiers, trapped in tunnels that had seemed impregnable moments before, found themselves facing a wall of fire that consumed everything. Private Watanabe, who had survived portable flamethrower attacks through careful positioning, discovered that tank-mounted systems left no room for escape. The flames followed him deeper into the tunnel complex, pursuing him through passages that had once provided sanctuary. But tank-mounted flamethrowers brought their own terrors for American crews. Sergeant Kowalski's tank carried 300 gallons of highly flammable fuel in a steel box, making every enemy anti-tank round a potential catastrophe. Japanese soldiers, desperate to stop the flame tanks, concentrated their heaviest weapons on the Shermans. "Anti-tank gun, 11 o'clock, shouted Chen as he spotted the muzzle flash from a concealed position. The 47mm shell struck Hell's Kitchen's front armor with a metallic clang that rang through the crew compartment. "Damage report," Kowalski called out. "No penetration," replied driver Tom Martinez, "but if they hit the fuel tanks." The implication hung in the air like smoke from burning tunnels. Unlike infantry flamethrower operators, who faced individual death tank crews, faced the possibility of being trapped in a burning steel coffin with hundreds of gallons of gasoline cooking off around them. Japanese defenders, witnessing the devastating effectiveness of the flame tanks, adapted their tactics with desperate innovation. Suicide attacks became common as individual soldiers attempted to reach the Shermans with satchel charges. The psychological dynamic had shifted again. Now it was Japanese infantry making desperate advances across open ground to attack American armor. Private Sato, armed with a 20-pound satchel charge, crawled through volcanic ash toward Hell's Kitchen as the tank continued pumping flames into tunnel entrances. His mission was simple: get close enough to place the explosive device against the fuel tanks and detonate it, even if it meant his own death. The flame tanks represented the ultimate evolution of the weapon that had started as a simple infantry tool. Now, armored, mobile, and carrying massive fuel supplies, they could clear entire tunnel complexes in minutes rather than hours. but they also represented the final escalation in a battle that had already consumed both armies. As Hell's Kitchen continued its methodical clearing of Japanese positions, both sides understood that the flame tanks would decide the outcome of Iwo Jima, one way or another. March 10th, 1945. The screaming had stopped. In the deepest levels of Tunnel Complex Alpha, the silence was more terrifying than any sound that had preceded it. Private First Class Danny Morrison crouched in the darkness, his flamethrower fuel gauge reading empty, listening to the drip of water somewhere in the volcanic rock. Around him, the bodies of American Marines and Japanese soldiers lay intermingled in positions that told the story of the final battle for Iwo Jima's underground heart. The distinction between victor and victim had vanished completely. Morrison's squad had entered these tunnels 3 hours earlier, pursuing Japanese defenders who had retreated deeper into the volcanic maze. Now, trapped by cave-ins, triggered by both sides, Americans and Japanese found themselves dying together in the suffocating darkness. "Morrison," came a weak voice from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. "Morrison, are you alive?" The voice belonged to Corporal Hayes, who had led the squad into this nightmare. But Morrison couldn't tell if Hayes was calling from 10 yards away or 100. The tunnel system had become a labyrinth, where sound bounced off volcanic walls in impossible directions. "I'm here, Corporal," Morrison called back, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "But I can't find you. The passages, they all look the same." What Morrison didn't know was that Hayes was trapped in a parallel tunnel just 20 feet away, separated by tons of volcanic rock that had collapsed when American engineers detonated charges to seal Japanese escape routes. The explosion had worked too well, trapping Marines and Japanese defenders together in chambers that had become a shared tomb. In the adjacent tunnel, Japanese Private Watanabe sat with his back against the rough volcanic wall, his Arisaka rifle lying useless beside him. Across from him, Marine Private Jenkins had propped himself against the opposite wall, his M1 Garand equally useless in the darkness. Both men were wounded, both were lost, and both understood that they would die together. "Water," Jenkins whispered in English, his voice barely audible. Watanabe looked at the American through the dim light filtering down from collapsed sections above. For 6 days, they had been trying to kill each other with horrible weapons. Watanabe had watched his friends burn alive. Jenkins had seen his squad mates tortured to death. But now, trapped together in the volcanic darkness, the war seemed like something that had happened to different people. Watanabe reached for his canteen and slowly slid it across the tunnel floor to Jenkins. The American nodded his thanks and took a careful sip before sliding it back. No words were spoken, but both men understood that they were no longer enemies. They were simply human beings waiting to die. Above them, the battle continued with mechanical precision. Sherman flame tanks methodically cleared tunnel entrance after tunnel entrance, pumping hundreds of gallons of burning gasoline into the underground network. The flames followed air shafts and ventilation passages, creating a spreading fire that consumed everything regardless of nationality. Staff Sergeant Kowalski, still commanding Hell's Kitchen, received radio reports that painted a picture of systematic destruction. Tunnel Complex 7 cleared. Estimated 40 Japanese casualties. Unknown American casualties. Complex 8 sealed with explosives. Complex 9 is burning, Sergeant. We can hear screaming from multiple air shafts. The screaming was coming from trapped Marines and Japanese soldiers alike. The flame attacks had become so widespread that tunnel systems originally held by Japanese defenders now contained American soldiers who had pursued their enemies too far into the maze. When the flames came, they consumed everyone equally. In Tunnel Complex Beta, Lieutenant Yamamoto made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, all 36 hours of it. Facing a choice between allowing American flame attacks to kill his remaining men slowly or ending their suffering quickly, he gave an order that violated every principle of military honor. "Seal the tunnels," he told Sergeant Ishida. "All of them. Use the remaining explosives." Ishida stared at his commander in shock. "Sir, we have our own men in those tunnels, and American prisoners." "I know," Yamamoto replied, his voice hollow with despair. "But the flames will reach them anyway. This way is faster." The explosions began at 11:30 in the morning, systematic detonations that collapsed tunnel after tunnel. Japanese soldiers trapped their own comrades and American prisoners together, choosing burial alive over burning alive. It was a mercy killing that encompassed both armies, a final acknowledgement that the battle had become too horrible for anyone to survive with humanity intact. Morrison heard the first explosion as a distant rumble through the volcanic rock, then another, closer. Then a series of blasts that seemed to come from all directions, accompanied by the grinding sound of tons of rock shifting and settling. "They're sealing us in," he said aloud, understanding finally that he would never see daylight again. But he was wrong about being alone. Throughout the tunnel network, American Marines and Japanese soldiers were discovering that they were not dying alone but together, trapped in chambers where the distinctions of nationality had been burned away by flame and buried under tons of volcanic rock. The tunnels that had begun as Japanese defensive positions had become a shared grave for both armies. Americans and Japanese, hunters and hunted, victims and perpetrators, in Nonit, all united in the final democracy of death beneath Iwo Jima's volcanic surface. The laughter that had echoed through these tunnels on February 19th was now buried forever under the weight of mutual destruction. March 26th, 1945. The silence was complete. On the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, the acrid smoke that had choked the island for 36 days finally began to dissipate in the Pacific wind. The black sand, once churned by 60,000 Marines and 22,000 Japanese defenders, now lay still beneath a grey sky that mourned the dead buried in the tunnels below. Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski climbed out of Hell's Kitchen, his flame tank finally silent after weeks of pumping liquid fire into the underground maze. The Sherman's fuel tanks were empty, its crew exhausted, its mission complete. Around him, the volcanic landscape looked like the surface of a dead planet. The statistics that would later define the Battle of Iwo Jima told only part of the story. Of the 380 American flamethrower operators who had landed on February 19th, exactly 18 survived. The 4-minute life expectancy that had seemed like cruel exaggeration proved to be generous. Japanese soldiers, who had entered the battle laughing at American fire toys, died screaming in concrete chambers that became their crematoriums. American Marines, who had seen flamethrowers as the solution, discovered that the weapon had turned them into something they no longer recognized. In the sealed tunnels below, the bodies of Private Morrison and Corporal Hayes lay 30 feet apart, separated by volcanic rock, but united in death with Japanese soldiers who had once been their mortal enemies. Private Watanabe and Marine Private Jenkins sat against opposite walls of their tomb, the empty canteen between them a final testament to shared humanity. Lieutenant Yamamoto never lived to see the battle's end. His decision to seal the tunnels with his own men inside had been discovered by surviving officers who shot him for treason. He died understanding that the line between honor and horror had been burned away. The volcanic ash that covered the island was no longer just the residue of ancient eruptions. Mixed with the grey powder were the cremated remains of Americans and Japanese alike, soldiers who had burned together in tunnels that had become their shared funeral pyre. General Kuribayashi's prediction had proven accurate. The Americans had indeed bled for every inch of Iwo Jima's volcanic soil, but his defensive strategy had exacted an unexpected price: his enemies. The complete destruction of his own force and the psychological devastation of his enemies. The flamethrowers that had started as tactical weapons had evolved into instruments of mutual genocide, consuming the humanity of both armies in fires that burned far hotter than the weapon's 2,000-degree flames. As the sun set on March 26th, Iwo Jima stood silent and empty. The laughter that had once echoed through Japanese tunnels was gone forever. The confident voices of American Marines were stilled permanently. In the end, there were no victors on Iwo Jima, only survivors carrying scars that would never heal, and the dead who had found democracy in the volcanic tunnels where Americans and Japanese burned together as equals in death. The war would continue, but the battle for Iwo Jima was finished. Both sides had learned that some victories cost more than defeat.